Okay, so we talked last time about Martin Luther and how the real significance of what he did was that he broke apart Christianity. He basically convinced a number of German princes to declare their independence from Rome so that he could organize the church in those territories along Lutheran lines, okay? And Lutheranism, of course, is a form of Protestantism, and that means that they're very, very keen on using the Bible as a source for Christian authority. Any matters of discipline are placed into the hands of the local prince. But generally, a good Protestant looks to the Bible. If it's in the Bible, then it's compulsory. If it's not in the Bible, then it is purely optional. Probably is a bad idea, in fact. Okay, so, and as I mentioned last time, this really opens Pandora's box, because if Luther can do it, then so can everyone else. The Bible is a big book. There's lots of things in the Bible, and it all depends on what you want to emphasize. And so this seems to be, it's the thing to do in the 16th century, is to read the Bible and using your brain, using your conscience, come up with a new interpretation of Christianity and see if it will fly. And so we'll talk today about three different ways to be Christian apart from Lutheranism. Okay, the first one is going to be Calvinism, and that comes to us from Jean Calvin. All right, it's not Jean Calvin, he's French. So Jean is the French form of John. Okay, Jean Calvin was a lawyer, all right, and as a pretty young man, in fact, he had a very intense conversion experience. But it's interesting. It was sort of a Protestant conversion experience. So the wool was lifted from his eyes, and he realized that the Catholic Church was entirely wrong, and that the Bible was the key to understanding Christianity. But he didn't just convert to Lutheranism. He read the Bible for himself, and he worked out sort of from his reading what Christianity ought to look like. And 3 years later, he published a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, basically an explanation of what Christianity is and how we ought to act as Christians. All right? Calvinism is perhaps most characterized by its doctrine of predestination. All right? That is buttressed in a number of places in the Bible. That is, that from before all time, God selected a limited number of people for salvation. Now, it's important to realize that we are all terrible people. We are just wretched creatures, and we all deserve condemnation. All right? But God, through his mercy and for reasons best known to himself, has elected a certain number of people for salvation. And it is for those people whom Christ died, okay? This is known as limited atonement, all right? When Jesus died, he didn't die for everyone. He died for the elect. So, either you're a member of the elect or you aren't. Either you're predestined for salvation or not. And no one knows what group you're in. Okay? In fact, nothing you do can move you from one group to another. You can be a member of the elect and behave very badly, and God will still allow you to be saved. Or you can be a member of the damned and behave very well indeed, but you're still going to hell. Now, you're not supposed to be a hedonist, obviously. You're supposed to live humbly. You're supposed to live in the expectation that you are a member of the elect. Okay? Okay, so yeah, the danger is that if you're a Calvinist, you might just give up and say, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm damned anyway, or I'm saved anyway, so I might as well just have some fun. Um, that's not what you're supposed to do, obviously. Calvin, as it happens, got his own little sandbox. In Switzerland, there's a canton called Geneva. It's in the western part, it's in the French part. And the Genevans voted to reform their church, so they declared their independence from the Roman Catholic Church. And they heard about this guy, John Calvin, and they invited him to come and direct their Reformation. So Calvin had the great good fortune of being able to put his ideas into practice. And because the danger was that people might descend into hedonism, he had sort of a religious police that would go around and stick their noses into people's affairs to make sure that they were behaving themselves. And if you got into trouble for gambling or excessive drinking or beating up your wife or anything like that, you would have to come and give a confession before the consistory court. All right, not just a private confession to a priest, but a public confession to the whole community. And so, needless to say, I don't think that Calvinism is very appealing to your average American, huh? I mean, we like the idea of free will. We don't like the idea of predestination. And not only that, we definitely don't like people sticking their nose into our private affairs. And so you think, how on earth did this religion come to be influential? Well, actually, it did. It was even more influential than Lutheranism. Number one is because it did not require state sponsorship. Now, as it happens, Calvin did have Geneva, but you did not have to live in Geneva in order to be a Calvinist. You could be a Calvinist on your own, in a Calvinist family or a Calvinist community or wherever you are. There are any number of French Calvinists called Huguenots. Huguenots were never in charge of France. All right? That's not the case with Lutheranism. At the beginning, it was essential that the prince be Lutheran. And the Lutheran church was a state church, and you had to live in a Lutheran state in order to be fully Lutheran. Okay? Perhaps more importantly, though, is that this brand of Christianity was ennobling to artisans and to other members of the middle class. Okay? Now, what do I mean by this? You don't know whether you're a member of the elect, but you can certainly get hints that you are. God will sort of give you signs that you are one of the saved. And one of the signs that you are saved is that if your business is doing well. Okay? So, and so that was a difference from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, certainly in the Middle Ages, was always pulling guilt trips on people for making too much money. All right, if you made too much money, that was a sin. That is money you've stolen from your fellow Christians, and the only way to expiate that sin is to give your money to the church. Okay, give it to charity. But along comes Calvinism, and basically, God wants you to be rich, or God wants you to work hard, and if you're rich as a byproduct of that, well, then that's just a sign of God's grace. So in that way, did Calvinism come to be more influential than Lutheranism? I say the French Calvinists are called Huguenots, but eventually it becomes the state church of the Netherlands, so the Dutch Reformed Church is Calvinist. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland is Calvinist, so Presbyterian churches in America ultimately trace their roots back to Calvin. And Puritans as well. We'll talk a little bit more about them, but Puritans were very much influenced by Calvinism. All right. Okay. How about Anabaptism? I don't know if this is a religion that you've heard of. Well, actually, you've heard of some forms of it. Okay? Anabaptists felt that Lutheranism and Calvinism didn't go far enough. Lutheranism requires state sponsorship. Calvinism can have it. But Anabaptists, they were very keen on, if we're going to use the Bible as our source of authority, well, we should be modeling our behavior and our Christian communities after the Christian communities that were described in the letters of St. Paul. All right? A small minority group huddled in a hostile world. All right? That Anabaptists certainly believe that getting your hands on political power is corrupting. And so they rejected the Catholic Church. They also rejected any state authority. All right? So it's a highly, they do have certain principles, but they're highly decentralized. And they're the sort of people who believe that you know you're right when the world is against you. Now, they have any number of things that they believe. Number one is that they do not believe in infant baptism. Okay? Baptism is a sacrament. It's described in the New Testament. Jesus underwent baptism when he was 30. Therefore, we should undergo baptism only when we are old enough to understand what is going on. Infant baptism is an abomination. And so, another Swiss, it's a Swiss German in fact, Conrad Grebel, in 1525, he and his friends basically baptized each other. And that's where we get the name Anabaptist, okay? Anabaptist means a rebaptizer. It was an insult, okay? It's one of these names that's like Gothic architecture. It's originally an insult. So an Anabaptist is a rebaptizer, but Conrad Grebel would simply say, nope, the first baptism didn't count. We're just baptizing each other. And they're persecuted by Catholics. They were also persecuted by Lutherans, okay? Again, Luther has interpreted the Bible. Doesn't mean you get to. A couple of years later, they came out with the Schleitheim Articles. Okay, yes, obviously adult baptism is number one. They're very keen on pacifism, right? When someone strikes one cheek, let him strike the other also. All right? They will not fight. They will not fight even in self-defense. They're the sort of people who believe that, we have to suffer for Jesus. We're not going to kill for Jesus. We will only suffer for him. There's a verse in the New Testament. Jesus says, don't take an oath. Just let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. So they will not take an oath, okay, lest you inadvertently violate that oath. And of course, there's another verse, again, St. Paul recommends this. If you see a brother sinning, you go and warn him. If he persists, you send 2 or 3 people, and if he still persists, then have nothing to do with him. So in an Anabaptist community, if someone persistently violates the norms, then they will shun him. They will not have anything to do with him. All right? Now, there aren't too many Anabaptists left in Europe. However, a number of Anabaptist groups did migrate to the New World, and you see them from time to time. There are Mennonites in Saskatchewan and the Dakotas. There are Hutterites, and for every now and then you see Amish. And of course, you cannot miss the Amish. They have a very distinct look, don't they? Again, this is not justified by the Bible. It's very interesting, isn't it, how tradition persists. You can drive out tradition with a pitchfork, but it always comes back. None of this practice is justified by the Bible, except they believe that they should be separate from the world. And so they signal that in various ways, often by having nothing to do with modern technology. So a lot of Amish groups will not drive cars. They prefer the horse and buggy. They dress in a particular way, plain dress, they call it. And there's all sorts of, every Amish community has its own set of rules. All right. but they are all Anabaptists. They believe in separating themselves out from the world, but they also believe in pacifism. They're not really a harm to anyone. Okay, finally, and we'll probably spend most time on this one. This is the Reformation in England, and it is linked up very much with English politics. It was a Reformation from above. Okay, now doubtlessly you've heard of Henry VIII, King Henry VIII. He reigned from 1509 to 1547, and he famously had 6 wives. Only the first 3 of these will concern us today, because it is each of these women produced 1 child for Henry. Right? Henry really, really, really wanted a son, and he finally got one from Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, who died in childbirth. Okay, so that was Edward. But Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, produced a daughter, Mary, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, produced Elizabeth. All right. So what's going on? Why does he have 1 child per wife, with the last 3 wives producing no children at all? Okay, Henry VIII, actually, well, there are a number of theories about him. I think he had something approximating borderline personality disorder, where he was best friends forever with you until you maybe left the cap off the toothpaste, and then you could do no right, and that was very dangerous for your health. It was off with your head. Okay, he as king, he could do that, and he frequently did. Anyone who pissed him off generally lost his life. And there are numerous theories how he got this way. Actually, as a prince, he was very, very charming. But at one point he had this jousting accident, and he was out cold for a few hours, and they thought he might have died. But in fact, he came to. But it seems that he suffered some kind of brain damage in such a way that it permanently altered his character. And he became, unfortunately, a bit of a tyrant after that. Catherine of Aragon. Aragon, of course, is in Spain. It's part of Spain. And Spain, we'll talk about this next time, Spain was on top of the world, because in 1492, Spain had discovered the New World and was on the up. God was clearly smiling on Spain. Lots of riches were coming back to Spain. So it was quite a diplomatic coup for the English to arrange a marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Prince Arthur, who was really the heir to the throne. Okay? Prince Arthur was going to become King Arthur. And unfortunately, he died. And were the English going to send back Catherine of Aragon to Spain along with her dowry? Of course not. They simply arranged for Catherine to marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. And so it is Henry who succeeded to the throne in 1509 on the death of his father, Henry VII, and Catherine of Aragon was crowned queen. She produced a daughter, but Henry really, really, really wanted a son. Actually, Henry VII, okay, Henry Tudor, had come to the throne in 1485 by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, okay? So, the Tudor dynasty was, they had won on the field of battle. And there were a lot of people who thought that they were kind of illegitimate. And so they were kind of insecure. And Henry VIII definitely wanted a son to carry on the dynasty. He didn't want a daughter because, of course, whoever she married would become king, and that would be the end of the Tudor dynasty. So he really wanted a son. And he didn't get one, though. He had one daughter through Catherine of Aragon, but then she produced a series of miscarriages and stillbirths. And so Henry started to wonder whether this wasn't God's punishment. Okay? Unfortunately, there are contradictory instructions in the Old Testament about this. On the one hand, if a brother dies leaving no heir, then the younger brother is compelled to marry that woman. But on the other hand, there's another verse that says that if you uncover your brother's wife's nakedness, that is an abomination. And so Henry was a little bit worried about this. He was wondering whether that verse wasn't the one that applied. And so he applied for a divorce from the Pope on this principle. Okay, but the Pope would not give him one. Clement the Seventh was the Pope at the time, and he'd given permission for the marriage to take place in the first place. He didn't want to go back on that. But he wasn't in any position to be granting any favors anyway, because Catherine's nephew, Charles V, who presided over the Diet of Worms, we talked about that last time, he's a little older now, and his troops have occupied Rome. So the Pope is in no position to be granting any favors to Henry VIII, dealing with the aunt of the guy who's giving him orders. So, what to do about this situation? Well, it seems that the thing to do is to declare your independence. Lots of people are doing it. It's all the rage. And people started putting this idea into Henry's head. And that's eventually what happened. If he separates from Rome, he can be head of the Church of England, and he can grant himself the divorce. Okay, so a number of things led to the Act of Supremacy. He bullies Parliament into declaring its independence from Rome, and Henry VIII is the supreme lord and governor of the Church of England. Most English people went along with this. All right, they thought maybe it was a temporary thing and it would blow over. If you had any kind of position to keep up, you basically had to personally adhere to the Act of Supremacy, and most people went along with that. There were some dissidents, okay? Chief of which is Thomas More, whom we've already met. He was the author of Utopia. He was an English humanist, but as it turns out, a rather fervent Catholic, and he did not believe he believed that the Christian Church, God put the Pope on the throne, and we have to believe in the Pope. So Thomas More is famously a martyr to the Catholic Church. More is often paired with John Fisher, who is Bishop of Rochester, who was also executed for the same reason. And there were a number of others who were executed for treason because they failed to support the Act of Supremacy. All right. So now Henry is head of the Church of England. He grants himself the divorce. He gets married to Anne Boleyn, one of his court favorites, and she produced a daughter for him, which really annoyed him. And then she produced another daughter, and so then he got very angry and had her executed. So that meant that he could marry Jane Seymour. What happened is that as head of the Church of England, he was not actually a Protestant, though. Maybe by the end of his life he had some Protestant sympathies, but he was at heart a Catholic. He believed in sort of Catholic theology. But the monasteries were too tempting a target for him. So, if he's going to do anything Protestant, he's going to dissolve the monasteries, right? And of course, that's just, purely venal on his part. And so they went around, they pensioned off all the monks, they seized all the monasteries and all their property, and handed it over to their supporters. So that's an episode in England from the 1530s and 40s. No more monasteries. Some monasteries were turned into churches, others became ruins. But if anyone was hoping that King Henry VIII would make the Church of England Protestant, their hopes were dashed in 1539 when he issued the 6 Articles, okay, which basically said we're going to have the Mass only in one kind, okay, so we're going to believe in transubstantiation. The priests are going to be celibate, they're not going to be allowed to be married. And of course, private confession is still on. So you confess your sins to a priest who has the power to forgive you, but he also has the power to impose penance on you. So that's all very Catholic. All right. Henry died in 1547. This meant that his son, the one whom he wanted so badly, comes to the throne in 1547. I mean, of course, he has 2 older sisters, but at the time, boys trumped girls. So men are more important than women. So he's the firstborn son. He becomes king at age 9 in 1547. And it was under Edward, under the 6 years of Edward, that the Church of England really did become Protestant. Edward had sort of been raised by Protestants. His Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was a committed Protestant. And so it is during Edward's reign that the C of E got real Protestant, and so they issued the Book of Common Prayer, which was a liturgy, a Protestant liturgy, the second one even more Protestant than the first. And they went around basically getting rid of all these vestiges of Catholicism, which they called popery, okay? Stained glass is vain, so we'll take down the stained glass. Statues are vain, and they're a violation of images, so they would take down any religious statues. Shrines to saints got destroyed. Incense was forbidden. Sanctus bells were forbidden. Priestly vestments were forbidden. Even stone altars were forbidden, okay? A stone altar suggests that that the Mass is a kind of sacrifice. Protestant communion is all about a memorial meal. So you had to have an altar that was made of wood and looked like a table. Okay, you could not have a stone altar. Now, was this welcomed or was it resisted? This is a great historical debate. And obviously it is informed very much by your own religious proclivities. Okay, so if you are a member of the Church of England, well, of course it was welcomed. The people were waiting for this. And they loved it. They gobbled it up. There was no resistance to it. But if you're Catholic, you think that, no, of course not. The people hated it, and they went along with it, but only because they were being bullied. Okay? Lately, it is that interpretation that has sort of won. Scarisbrick and Eamon Duffy are 2 historians who basically pointed out that, the number of stone altars that were buried in churchyards, all right, clearly, it's like they were burying it in the hopes that someday they'd be able to dig it up and use it again, right? They didn't destroy these things. They sort of hid them, which suggests that they didn't like this. People like stuff that they're familiar with, particularly in a religious point of view, and they really dislike sudden change, especially stuff that seems to be making the world a little more ugly, What's wrong with stained glass? What's wrong with the statue of St. Peter? All right? And so, the typical Protestant church was whitewashed. If there's any emblems at all, it's going to be texts like the 10 Commandments or the Lord's Prayer. And that's all the entertainment you get. It's not a feast for the senses the way that a Catholic church might be. All right. Well, Edward VI was a sickly young boy, and he died at age 15 in 1553, which meant that now the throne, now we've gone through the boys, now we have to go to the girls. And who are those girls? Well, Queen Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and then Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. They tried to secure a Protestant succession. Edward's cousin, Jane Grey, was stuck on the throne by his advisors, but she had no legitimacy at all. She was queen for all of 9 days before Mary Tudor appeared at the head of an army and had Jane Seymour put in prison, and she assumed her rightful position as Queen of England, daughter of Henry VIII. And if you know anything about Queen Mary, she has the nickname Bloody Mary. Okay? There's a song in South Pacific about that. All right? But the point is that she was Catholic. She was sort of impervious to all the cool Protestantism that was running around. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon remained Catholic. And I mean, Catherine of Aragon and Mary Tudor were both rather bitter about Henry VIII's treatment of them. And so they clung to their Catholicism as an emblem of that. And so once she is queen, England rejoined the Church of Rome. Presumably they could dig out those stone altars again. But she went around, and basically if you had any position to keep up, you had to claim that you were Catholic again. And you had to repudiate your former Protestantism, and if you refused to do that, you were executed for heresy. All right? Including Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, was burnt at the stake. She even executed Lady Jane Grey, which was a bit of a miscarriage of justice, given that Jane Grey was all of 17 years old and the plaything of her advisors. So in the 5 years of Mary's reign, about approximately 450 people were executed for heresy. That's how she got her nickname, Bloody Mary. This is a bit unfair. All monarchs execute people. It's just that she is particularly known for her executions because of someone by the name of John Foxe, who wrote a book called The Book of Martyrs, which described all of these executions in particularly lurid detail, and they were illustrated by lurid woodcuts as well. This turned out to be one of the more popular books in English in the 16th century, and so Mary became forever associated with her executions. All right. A bit unfair, but I mean, she really did execute those people. Now, a lot of people got out of England. Okay. These are known as the Marian exiles. A lot of them went to Geneva to hang out with John Calvin and to become Calvinized. All right, so that is going to have an effect. Mary married Philip of Spain, okay, the great Catholic monarch of Spain, but she produced no heir. She had, it's rather unfortunate, for 1558 she was ordered the church bells of London to ring because she was about to give birth, but it turns out it was just a big tumor. And so she died heartbroken in 1558, having produced no heir and not guaranteed the Catholic succession to the throne. Here are a couple of woodcuts from Foxe's Book of Martyrs. There is Thomas Cranmer. He famously, he signed a recantation, but then he went back on it And so he was burnt at the stake, and as he was being burnt at the stake, he held out his hand to be burnt first, as though to say, like, I signed that, and I'm, if my right hand causes me to sin, then cut it off. That's what he was doing. And then in the other one there, this was a particularly lurid one. They were burning a pregnant woman at the stake, and so she was burnt up, fetus and all. The fetus falls out, and then someone throws that onto the fire for particularly, it's just rubbing your face in how awful these wicked Catholics are. I don't know if that's true or not. It does not seem to be. It might be a little bit exaggerated. Okay. Peratine Massey was her name. In any event, 1558, Queen Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, comes to the throne. Henry's second daughter. She had been raised as a Protestant. But the great thing about Elizabeth was that she was religiously tolerant. Okay, as long as you recognized her as the head of the Church of England, then she didn't really particularly care about sort of uniformity of religious practice. All right, and that was the whole notion of the Elizabethan settlement. Okay, it was an attempt at satisfying all members of the Church of England. Okay, because there are members of the Church of England now who want it to be more Protestant. There are other people who want it to be Catholic without the Pope. Okay, and so this is the great thing about the Church of England. It's always, since 1559, it has considered itself to be a kind of big tent. So you can be a high Anglican, which is like all the smells and bells and stained glass and stone altars and whatnot, or you can be a low Anglican, which is much more Protestant. All right. And she came out with her own version of the prayer book, which again was a kind of a compromise between these two camps. Puritans, I said we'd talk about them. These are people who got their batteries charged at Geneva. They come back to England, and they are hoping to purify it of Catholic ritual. Okay, Puritans are not tolerant. All right, they believe in uniformity, and they believe that they should be dictating that uniformity. All right, because they're not just meddlesome and nosy. They truly believe that this is what we need to do to save our souls. They truly believe that God will punish us for tolerating this sort of thing. Elizabeth had a crucifix up in her private chambers, and that's a cross with Jesus hanging on it. Okay, so it's a statue. Puritans thought that these were particularly associated with Catholicism. They thought of it as the abomination of desolation. That's what they called the crucifix up in Elizabeth's private chamber. As for genuine Catholics, okay, those who recognize the Pope, the Pope himself was holding out for some kind of a compromise, but when one didn't appear, he excommunicated Elizabeth in 1571. And what that meant is that his English Catholics were now free and even encouraged to try to assassinate the Queen. All right. Certainly, they were not compelled to obey her. Well, that wasn't a very good move on the part of the Pope, because that made life very, very difficult for English Catholics, those who remained. English Catholics were now seen as a security threat. And, you could call Elizabeth Bloody Elizabeth if you wanted, because she executed any number of Catholics, okay? But there's no fox here. There's no Catholic fox, all right? Instead, what we have is the Elizabethan age of English literature, all right? She had the great good fortune to preside over Shakespeare, Sir Philip Sidney, Sir Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, okay, Ben Jonson, all those wonderful English playwrights you read in English class. And that portrait of Elizabeth there, that is one of about 30 surviving portraits. That's a whole field of study, by the way, Elizabeth's portraits. So she had a great image. She had great PR. Okay, Sir Walter Raleigh considered himself kind of one of she was his lady, and he was going to serve her like some knight on horseback. So there you go. And she lasted on the throne for quite a while. She wasn't sickly like Edward or Mary. So she went from 1558 down to 1603. Now, she did not produce an heir. In fact, she never married. Okay, she was, of course, the Virgin Queen, after whom Virginia is named, by the way, the American state of Virginia. She deliberately didn't get married, in fact, because she knew that the minute she did, all power would float through her husband, and she didn't want that. So she would flirt with people and claim, oh, yes, I'm going to make up my mind. Well, who is it? Oh, I haven't made up my mind yet, and so on and so forth. So eventually it dawns on people that she's never going to get married. Fortunately, her cousin, the King of Scotland, all right, James, was Protestant. And so in 1603, when she died, James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. And that united Scotland and England under the same monarch, and James Stuart continued the Protestantization of England. Okay, so here is one final piece of artistic evidence. You have the family of Henry VIII, an allegory of the Tudor succession. There is Henry, and to the one side you've got his son Edward, and then Elizabeth. Okay, and that's sort of the side of peace. Okay, you've got that allegorical figure bringing sort of agricultural products. On the other side, there's Mary and Philip. They're bringing war. All right. So yeah, you can't airbrush Mary out of history, but the idea is that that was a kind of embarrassing interlude. All right. Henry VIII broke from Rome. Edward made it Protestant. Elizabeth secured the Protestantism, and Mary, well, that was we won't talk too much about that. Anyways, my friends, this is where the Church of England comes from. The Anglican Church in America, it's known as the Episcopal Church. This is one other way to be Protestant. All right. We'll talk about the Catholic response next time.